Ryan, first to you. Until 4 years ago, most Americans paid little attention to the date, January 6th. So what do we expect this time, both inside and outside the House?
Yeah, Andrea, I think it'll be somewhat of a regression to the mean. This is going to be a lot like it used to be for decades up here on Capitol Hill, where the simple certification of the electoral votes that were cast is given the thumbs up by members of Congress, and that paves the way for the inauguration without very much drama. In fact, inside the House and Senate chambers, it's going to look very much like that. It's not going to look like it was 4 years ago when you saw these violent rioters attacking the Capitol and trying to stand in the way of the peaceful transfer of power. Now, that's what you'll see in the TV cameras. But outside of this building, in the halls of this building, you do see a much different posture than what we saw before. This is a national security event now. That means there is fencing up and around the Capitol complex, not just on Capitol Square itself around the Capitol building, but around the House and Senate office buildings as well. There is an enormous law enforcement presence. You see police officers from the Capitol Police, from D.C. Metro Police, even from the New York City Police Department in and out of the halls of the Capitol here today, and also an increased presence of just security personnel, making sure that everyone has the appropriate credentials to be on this building on this day. Now, despite all that massive security presence, there isn't a real threat here today, and that's because the biggest difference between what happened here in 2017 versus what's happening now in 2021 versus what's happening now in 2024 is that Donald Trump won this time around. He didn't lose, and there's been no effort by his supporters or anyone else to protest this election result. In fact, Democrats have gone to great pains to show that they understand that they lost the election, and they are not going to stand in the way of the peaceful transfer of power, much different than what we saw 4 years ago. Meanwhile, Donald Trump, for his part, continues to say that he bears no responsibility for what took place here on January 6th, and has even suggested that he's prepared to pardon some of the hundreds of rioters that were convicted for the role they played here on that day. So, Andrea, it's going to be much different than it was 4 years ago, but it's going to be much more like it was in the decades prior to what happened here 4 years ago.
And, Jackie, this morning I spoke with former Capitol Police Officer Harry Dunn. He was, of course, there on January 6th. He was one of the 4 officers who testified to the January 6th committee. He says he's in disbelief about where we are today. Take a listen. Just physically, mentally, PTSD, how are you doing?
I've had a lot of time to heal. I've had a lot of people around the country, around the world, be so supportive, and I'm thankful for them. But it still tugs at my heart a little bit that we're here and Donald Trump is heading back to the White House. It's just unfortunate that what we went through, I won't say it's in vain because we protected the democracy. We allowed the transfer of power to happen, but not without great loss.
Jackie, he really is that tall. It's kind of humorous, but Jackie, it's obviously a sober moment for all of those officers, for their families. Daniel Hodges is going to be in the gallery at Adam Schiff's invitation. So reflect on these attempts to rewrite the violence that happened that day.
Yeah, Andrea, and if it's any consolation, I'm 5'11", and even I look up to Harry Dunn. He's so tall. But this idea of betrayal is something that keeps coming up in conversations with some of the police officers and law enforcement officials who risked their lives on January 6, 2021 during that attack to protect the democratic process that makes our country really what it is. This idea of pardoning 1,600 January 6th defendants is also something that some of those involved with defending the Capitol on that day are feeling really betrayed by. I mean, Donald Trump spent the last 4 years essentially rewriting the history of January 6th. And by all accounts, he has really sort of been pretty convincing with all of his supporters, hosting John Eastman, as Von Hilliard just listed, and a handful of the chief architects of people who created the plan to try to stop the electoral certification at Mar-a-Lago over the weekend, and praising them for their efforts and continuing to propagate falsehoods and criticisms of Mike Pence for failing to follow through with that certification. But our colleague Spencer Hugh, he had an interview with U.S. Capitol Police Chief Tom Manger on Sunday, in the eve of the 4th anniversary of the attack who said that he was really against Trump promising to pardon these 1,600 defendants, and he called it the wiping away of accountability for attacks against law enforcement, and that this goes beyond politics at the end of the day, but it's just a negative message that's sent to police officers across the nation that, as he said, quote, if someone doesn't think that a conviction for assault or worse against a police officer is something that should be upheld, what do we ask police officers to do every day? It's I think a dramatically different day than it was 4 years ago. Obviously, much smoother, as Ryan pointed out, but one of sort of introspection and I think some sour feelings amongst those who are currently on the Hill right now, protecting our lawmakers as they do in and out every single day.
And I know lawmakers and I know journalists who were in the chamber and were trapped in the chamber and who still have effects and are very, very reluctant to be here today, as a matter of fact, because it's still so raw. Michael Steele, Donald Trump is bringing groups of congressional Republicans to Mar-a-Lago next weekend, including Freedom Caucus members, blue state Republicans. What does this invitation list indicate to you after he played a critical role on Friday during the first roll call in cementing the speakership, by such a narrow margin for Mike Johnson?
Yeah, no, I think, what Donald Trump has been doing for quite some time now is effectively locking in his control of the Republican members of Congress to try to remind them that they are where they are because of him, and they will be able to stay where they are because of him. The power they have, he gives to them. That's the symbolism, if you will, of what we saw just the last few days with Johnson's election. Every effort was made to make sure that happened on the first ballot. And a number of us were, kind of sitting there going, oh, this is going to be a done deal on the first ballot, because you knew that Trump was going to come in at that right moment and say, okay, this is what I need to have happen. So this idea of Mike Johnson owing him and those members that he spoke to being, cajoled or threatened or whatever happened, that's all part of the narrative. And I think when you broaden the lens out real quick, if I could, Andrea, to what Jackie just said, which I think was very important, to not, misunderstand the realities of Capitol Hill this moment. But for me, a lot of this was less of looking back at history or history, sort of being that placeholder, but more of what Donald Trump's saying and what Republicans are saying. This is okay. What happened on January 6th 4 years ago was okay. This is how we do it now. This is how the game is going to be played in order to keep power and to control power and to make sure we get our way. Everybody, all the Republicans around town are giddy about about today. This quote peaceful transfer of power. Why? Because they won. Now, if they hadn't won, what would today be like? What would we be saying here in this moment? We'd be probably in a very similar space to 4 years ago, because that drumbeat of control for power and retribution would have been signaled. But there's no need for that now, because everything fell in place the way we wanted it to. We're getting our way. And that's going to be something to be interesting to watch play out, not just today with the events today, but with what we've already seen with how Donald Trump came in and saved Mike Johnson's speakership. So how do you think Mike Johnson is going to repay him?
Well, then that's such a very good question, Ashley Parker, because the other piece of this is the Freedom Caucus and some of the others who really are not happy with Mike Johnson, not on a personal level the way they were unhappy with Kevin McCarthy, but over spending and over what happened with the debt ceiling whether with the not the debt ceiling. Well, yes, the debt ceiling vote, but more importantly, with the continuing resolution. And it's no accident that there were 9 people who initially withheld their votes. 3 who voted for other people, 6 who didn't vote at all. And that was all a signal, a very strong signal, because it now will take 9 to vacate the speakership. And that was a signal to Mike Johnson, very clearly not a coincidence, that they could take him down anytime they want to.
That's right. I mean, both things are true, and it creates this fascinating fine line that the speaker will have to try to walk, which on the one hand, as Michael Steele just articulated quite well, President-elect Trump has tremendous power. Republicans, the entire party is on the whole incredibly loyal to him. And even those who privately might wish he was doing different things at times, different priorities, behaving differently, are also largely fearful of him. He's shown a willingness to play in primaries and be quite effective. So through that combination of loyalty and respect and fear, right now at least, he does have the ability to largely move his party in Congress where he wants it to go. The flip side is there are incredibly narrow margins for Republicans in both the House and the Senate. And on some issues where there is still a real disagreement in a party that Donald Trump has essentially taken over. Take, for instance, foreign policy and aid to Ukraine. When there are those fault lines and there's that dissent and people disagree with the president and they disagree with the speaker, there's not very much room for error at all. And that's something that obviously Speaker Johnson is well aware of. He's reminded of it, and he's going to have to grapple with just about every day that he remains speaker.